I believe that we are going to get along with the Russian people very, very well.
The Iron Curtain has descended across the country.
And resolute action.
I shall go to Korea.
I am not and never have been a member of the Communist Party.
We shall pay any price, bear any burden, support any friend, oppose any foe.
No, we won't go.
We believe that peace is at hand.
Will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States.
We understand each other better. That's a key to peace.
The Eagle and the Bear, dispatches from the Cold War. Dateline, 1973, the Middle East.
We are the oldest nation. The oldest written history, 7,000 years. The oldest government. We are very proud.
Brave, proud words, but hiding a humiliation. President Sadat's Egypt had lost a major part of its territory, the Sinai Desert. Here, the Arab nations would soon strike to avenge their losses from the Six-Day War of 1967. This time, tension between the superpowers would be stretched almost to the nuclear breaking point. The 1967 Six-Day War had changed the map of the Middle East. Fearing a united Arab attack, Israel struck first and swiftly wiped out the combined armed forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Israel tripled in size, capturing the Sinai to the Suez Canal, the west bank of the Jordan, and the Syrian Golan Heights.
Will those in favor of this draft resolution please signify by raising their hands?
The war ended in the United Nations with the passage of Resolution 242, which stated that Israel would give back the captured territories in exchange for peace. But Israel refused to withdraw. U.S. arms to Israel increased, and the Soviet Union backed Syria and Egypt. Instead of peace, the Middle East found continued chaos. Palestinian refugees poured from Israel into Jordan. Once temporary, tent villages began to look permanent. Disaffected Palestinians flocked to radical guerrilla groups and began to prepare for war. Next door, Israel grew and prospered.
The first reaction was a great strengthening of Israel's place within the international system. We must remember that a few weeks, even a few days before the war, there's a lot of talk about whether Israel would survive. We were pictured as building air raid shelters, preparing hospital beds, vainly appealing for external assistance, asking the great powers what, if anything, they were going to do. And here, within a few days, there was this dramatic transition from the image of Israel, as it were, cowering upon the brink of destruction, to an Israel which had removed all its enemies from any proximity to its populated centers.
Israeli strength did not deter Arabs, hungry for the return of their lands. And radical Palestinians, members of the terrorist group Black September, were becoming more and more bold in asking for and getting international attention. Dawson Field, Jordan, 1970. Black September blew up 3 empty hijacked airliners. It was in this volatile setting that Anwar Sadat became president of Egypt. Like most other Arabs, he was haunted by the 1967 war. He wrote, "I myself was completely overwhelmed by our defeat. It sank into the very fabric of my consciousness. My basic task was to wipe out the disgrace and humiliation." Under pressure from Arab leaders, Sadat felt compelled to break the stalemate with Israel. His options were limited. Egypt's economy was a shambles, its people racked with poverty. And its biggest military supplier, the Soviet Union, was far from dependable. Moscow often promised Sadat arms and did not send them. But the Egyptian people were passionate to go to war. Sadat, caught between public anger and the practical reality of limited arms, first looked for a diplomatic solution. He began secret initiatives to the U.S. government, hoping to buy time for diplomacy. Sadat proclaimed 1971 the year of decision and threatened to go to war. When the year of decision ended without one, Sadat was running out of time.
The people here are blaming him, that he is just telling propaganda about war, and he is not willing really to start war.
January 16, 1972. Anti-Sadat student riots rocked the Egyptian capital, Cairo.
At that time, the students were bitterly against him, complaining. There were jokes about him all over the Middle East. People were laughing at him, ridiculing him. The economy was going badly, and there was no hope, no prospect of improvement.
In repeated trips to the Soviet Union, Sadat was refused promised arms.
It was not my fault that I couldn't achieve this. I have agreed with the Soviet Union leaders about certain amounts of arms that would reach me before the end of the year. So, and they agreed, but they didn't fulfill. I lost a lot of my popularity. And then everything came on July 72 when I made my decisions to send out the Soviet experts.
Egypt's proud and religious people cheered Sadat's decision to expel the Soviets, but Washington paid little heed.
Here are the riflemen, the men with what appear to be, I suppose, submachine guns. These are the Germans. They are the men trying to free the Israelis. These are not Arab commandos. These are on
At the Munich Olympics, Palestinian terrorists seized world attention. The hooded gunmen of Black September kidnapped 9 Israeli athletes and held them hostage. After hours of threats, all 9 lay murdered. World sympathy went out to Israel. Palestinian terror cast a cloud over all Arabs, including the Egyptians, and thwarted Sadat's efforts for better relations with the U.S. Finally, Sadat called a secret meeting with his chief military advisors.
In this meeting, for 3 hours discussions, Sadat told them, I am convinced that now the question is to be or not to be. With the arms we have in our hands, we must start war.
Seeing Sadat's new resolve, leaders of the oil-rich Arab nations began buying Soviet-made arms for Egypt. Guns in hand, Sadat began to lay plans for war. The Eagle and the Bear will return in a moment. We now return to the Eagle and the Bear. In Israel and around the world, Jews marked their most sacred holiday, the Day of Atonement. Yom Kippur. Across the Suez Canal, there were no sounds of prayer. Egyptian soldiers were putting finishing touches on their preparations for war. The attack would begin at midday, so the hot desert sun would shine in Israeli eyes. At 1:55 p.m., Egyptian airstrikes across the Sinai Desert. Under a shield of shells, missiles, and smoke, thousands of Egyptians began crossing the Suez Canal. Their aim was to penetrate the formidable Israeli battlement along the canal, the Bar-Lev line.
I was in the operation room and I received the reports one by one. The strong points of the Bar-Lev line is surrendering and is captured. And after 4 hours exactly, about 6 o'clock, it was quite obvious that the Israelis has lost their balance. At that time, I told my people in the operation room, my forces, I told them, felicitations. The Israelis has lost their balance.
In the Golan Heights, just before 2 p.m., Syria launched a devastating attack against Israel. In Tel Aviv and miles away in Washington, leaders were caught off guard.
I was asleep. About 6 in the morning, Joe Sisko, who was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, woke me up and said, there's something going on along the Suez Canal. And if you get on the phone immediately, we can get it settled within the next few hours. I got on the phone immediately, but we didn't get it settled in the next few hours.
October 8th, day 3. The situation for Israel was desperate on the Sinai, with heavy losses and unprotected soldiers fleeing in terror. Slowly, the staggering Arab achievement began to be felt in Tel Aviv.
It was aimed as a limited operation. The land was not my aim at all. I wanted only to prove to the whole world that the Israeli theory of security would collapse and we would cross the canal and we could capture the Bar-Lev line. These were my aims.
Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir sent frantic pleas to the U.S. for aid. Meir relied on another weapon, Israeli passion.
We will win because we must live. Our neighbors are fighting not for their lives, not for their sovereignty. They are fighting to destroy us.
On October 11th, Israel slowly gained the upper hand against Syria, slaughtering hundreds of Syrian soldiers and pushing tanks and men behind the pre-war lines.
The situation is going better and better. I would say that we managed to take the initiative.
October 13th, the U.S. began a massive resupply of Israel and quickly turned the tide of war. With fresh supplies, Israelis struck at Egyptian forces scattered across the Sinai. As the fighting continued, Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin flew to Cairo. Fearing total Arab defeat, he tried to persuade Sadat to accept a ceasefire. Finally, on October 20th, Sadat announced that he could beat Israel, but not the U.S. On October 22nd, at the United Nations, Egypt, Syria, and Israel agreed to a ceasefire. Within hours, Israeli troops insisting that Arabs had fired first broke the ceasefire and attacked Syria. One day later, Israel attacked Egypt, encircling the Egyptian Third Army and making yet another dramatic crossing of the Suez Canal. Sadat frantically called for American and Soviet help.
The Soviet Union urged that we, the United States, join them in sending a conventional peacekeeping force into the area. Well, I wasn't about to buy that. Then Brezhnev sent a very tough message indicating that in the event we did not agree to go in together with him, he unilaterally was going to send forces into the area to impose peace on Israel, of course.
War in the Sinai had begun to jeopardize détente. Caught in the turmoil of the Watergate scandal, President Nixon was willing to do anything to prevent Moscow from putting troops in the Middle East.
We did not suggest to him, we did not threaten to him or to his ambassador that in the event that they moved in unilaterally, we would bomb Moscow. But on the other hand, it was implicit that in the event that they did move in, we would have to react. And under the circumstances, if we did react, you always had to consider that it might go to the ultimate weapon.
The U.S. reacted. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, all American military forces were placed on DEFCON 3, Worldwide Nuclear Alert. The Eagle and the Bear will return in a moment. We now return to the Eagle and the Bear.
November, Alpha, Tango, Echo.
Early on the morning of October 25th, 1973, with U.S. forces on strategic alert, crisis was averted in the Middle East. The Soviet Union backed down and agreed not to send troops to the Sinai. The worldwide military alert was called off. After 3 weeks of war, the guns of Egypt, Syria, and Israel fell silent. Eventually, UN peacekeeping troops would ensure the ceasefire. In the U.S., Americans were preoccupied with another matter.
I just put $5 in last night and already I'm empty.
I was going to get gas here, but not for 93 cents. That's ridiculous.
Well, they don't believe you when they see the no gas sign, that's for sure.
To punish America for supporting Israel, the Arab oil-producing nations banded together and imposed a total oil embargo on the U.S.
We are heading toward the most acute shortages of energy since World War II.
The Yom Kippur War had reached the freeways of the U.S.
One day we were selling cars like crazy, and the next day, disaster. The oil embargo came along, and couldn't sell big cars at all. As a matter of fact, people that had bought big cars were bringing them back and leaving them on the lot. So here, I don't want it. I won't be able to buy gas for it.
Sharply criticized for her handling of the war, Golda Meir and her cabinet resigned in April of 1974. Israelis called the war a military victory, but the Arabs had won too.
1973 ended in a kind of atmosphere more conducive to negotiation. Israel had won a military victory, a spectacular military victory, but there had before that been moments of anguish and peril and loss. The Arabs had really been defeated because we ended up 41 kilometers from Cairo and from Damascus and 101 kilometers from Cairo. But before that, they had some moments of pride. They had made inroads into our positions. They had created a tremendous scare in Israel. So there was, for the first time, I would say, enough pride on the Arab side and enough humility on the Israeli side to make both of us willing to reach a negotiating table.
In November of 1973, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger made his first tour of the Middle East, beginning what would become known as shuttle diplomacy. In January of 1974, Israel and Egypt agreed to a truce, with Israel giving up 15 miles of the Sinai. And in May, Israel and Syria reached a compromise agreement. After 6 months, the crisis had passed. The Arab nations lifted the oil embargo. In June of 1974, President Nixon flew to Cairo. He was the first U.S. president to visit the Arab nation since Franklin Roosevelt had traveled there during World War II.
It has been too long that our two nations have been through a period of misunderstanding and non-cooperation. And today marks the day when, by your meeting with the President of the United States, the two presidents of Egypt and the United States meeting together, we cement the foundations of a new relationship.
Friendship with the U.S. isolated Egypt from the other Arab nations. Those nations, angered by U.S. support of Israel, moved closer to the USSR. The 1973 Middle East War left a desert littered with debris. Ancient rivals, a promised land, drawn into the ongoing conflict between the eagle and the bear.
Wednesday, the submarine proves a decisive weapon in the staging of underwater offensives on America at War. Now stay tuned for Arthur Rubinstein and the London Symphony Orchestra, next on A&E.